Welcome to Let There Be Answers, episode 6. Hi, Leandro.
Hi, John. Tell us first. Just remind us what you're doing there.
So, I was this weekend I've spent at a conference of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, which had its annual meeting in Minneapolis. And it was really wonderful to talk to a lot of sociologists and other social scientists who study religion. And on the one hand, I was invited to address a panel discussion um, on essentially how social media is affecting different components of lived religion, and also some sociologists who have been actually studying Center Place and Beyond the Walls, our ministry, as a phenomenon, are also there. And so I got to talk to a lot of religious scholars who are kind of interested in what we're doing as a new kind of way to have church and all that kind of thing. And so it was fun to be able to talk about that. And so I'm trying to go to more conferences so that people who are in our audience at Center Place lectures and so on, if you're interested in these kind of topics that we do, you might be interested in academic conferences. And I'm going to publish my schedule, and I'd be happy to meet you. So I met several people this last weekend who have watched all of the lectures, they told me, and it was just really wonderful to be able to meet some really thoughtful people who are part of our community. And so we'll tell you more. We'll give people updates when I'm going to be going to other academic conferences in the next year.
Wonderful. And I want to remind everyone that just tonight, although we have some questions that we have collected from the comments that you left on our videos recently, we also will be taking questions that you write down in the live chat. So please remember to tag at Center Place in when you send your questions on the YouTube chat, so that that'll help me find your question better. And yeah, why don't we just get started, John, with a question that we got from Dartharama, who says, "What do you, John and Leandro, think about the Moses scroll? Do you believe Shapira? In my opinion, Shapira sold replica trinkets like most dealers, but he did it to invest in the real historical items. I think he was dismissed as a fraud very quickly by top scholars of his day." I'll let you
Well,
answer that.
yeah, this is a really interesting topic, Dartharama, and you're correct that the scholars of his day dismissed what we're calling like the Moses scroll really quickly. And so let's just give some people some backstory about this. So there was a guy in the 19th century named Moses Shapira who exhibited several leather strips that had writing on them in London back in the 1880s. And the amazing thing about these is that they are written in Paleo Hebrew, that is to say, the writing system that would have existed in the first temple period of Judaism. When they come back, when the exiles come back in the second temple period, they've switched over to the Aramaic writing system, which is what we think of as modern Hebrew. But this would have been the earlier kind of writing system, which is almost indistinguishable. It's similar to Phoenician, for example. So and so this would have been lines from Deuteronomy, including the Ten Commandments, written in Paleo Hebrew. And so, if legitimate, this would constitute, just an amazing find. Like the one of the potentially earliest documents that is giving us part of the Bible, earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, presumably, and before we found the Dead Sea Scrolls by us, not many decades. So the problem, like Dartharama, like you said, so Moses Shapira already had a reputation as a fraudster, and you are, I think, giving him a very benefit of the doubt kind of reading, which is that, well, maybe he did, have a bunch of fraudulent trinkets, but he was using that to make money to find good, real historic finds. Um, and and so his contemporaries did not give him that kind of benefit of the doubt that you would like to, and so it was almost immediately denounced as a fraud. And within a year, he actually committed suicide. So what can we say about this now? So we have facsimiles of these scrolls, and we also have translations, but the originals have all been lost. And there have been in the last century a handful of modern scholars who've tried to do reassessments and say, well, maybe there's a possibility that these aren't frauds. However, others have pointed to numerous kinds of oddities, that the way that the characters are drawn, is more like, for example, the way the Moabite stele is drawn, and that this is and this was something that had already been published. In other words, there's these different things about it that still, with what we have, kind of put it in the category, if you're weighing the scales, of forgery. And the reality is that, in modern times, in the 19th century onward, there is so much temptation to find things that would be amazing, and therefore for people to make forgeries of them in order to find them. Um, for me, the balance is on that side, and so whereas it would be super fun if such a thing were found, these kinds of forgeries were very common in the 19th century. I'm here in Minnesota. This is one of the places where I grew up. And so one of the things that we have here in Minnesota, there's what's called the Kensington Rune Stone, which was an idea that the Vikings would have come all the way to Minnesota and carved this in. But it's like a forgery from the late 19th, early 20th century, or whatever it is, because people were making these things. And so, unfortunately, I would definitely come on that side unless there was something more that we have based on the provenance being very bad, based on the guy's background, and based on the documents themselves. Even if it were, it doesn't add much. It does add like an additional line to the Ten Commandments that is not otherwise attested. But I don't know. It does. I don't know that it tells us much if it were true. So
People are admiring the car collection behind you, John.
oh, what are we looking at behind
Oh,
me? The car collection? Oh yeah, all the little cars. Yeah, so I'm at my brother's house, and so we also might see at different times any one of his 6 cats. That's my brother's a crazy cat gentleman, and so we'll see maybe 7 of them.
all right. Thank you, Ryan M, for supporting the channel with your super chat. We have a question, John, that came in the live chat. If you
Okay.
want to address, it's from Todd Rodmaker, who says, "Do you think that the first 2 chapters of Luke were added were added later to the gospel? There are a later addition to the gospel?"
Yeah. So the first two chapters of Luke, um, in a way, are a different component of the gospel than what the author of Luke's source. So the author of Luke is obviously using Mark as a source, and Mark begins with the John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus narrative. And so when we get to chapter 3 of Luke, that's where the Gospel of Luke lines up with Luke's source, which is Mark. And so you can see why then, if you're doing that, and there's also if Luke is also using a lost saying source Q, that also doesn't have any nativity story. And so the first 2 chapters are Luke's Christmas story, and so therefore it is a distinct component of it. And so Todd, so some scholars have posited this. This is a minority position, because we have an ancient, we have ancient historiography in this, where we know that the Marcion and the Marcionites used a Gospel of Luke and some of Paul's letters. And one of the things we know about the Gospel of Luke that the Marcionites used is it didn't include that first 2 chapters, that nativity story. And so when scholars have made the case that maybe Luke is actually a Marcionite gospel that was then expanded So what we have is actually an expanded version of a Marcionite gospel. Then the idea is that those two chapters of Luke are an add-on, because we have this idea that there's a Marcionite gospel of Luke that doesn't include those. But that's a minority position, and what my own position and my own feeling, and if you're asking me, I don't think that's probably the case. I think it's more likely the case that Marcion has edited the original Gospel of Luke and deleted those two chapters in order to have something that fits more Marcion's theology. So Marcion is very interested in limiting his canon. He is prepared to delete the entire Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, from the canon, and I think therefore it's conceivable that he's prepared to delete a couple chapters out of Luke as well. And I also think stylistically, the first two chapters are part of Luke's really amazing creation. Luke is an incredible writer, and so this is the entire story of John the Baptist's parents, Zechariah being made mute, and the Annunciation, and the shepherds and everything like that. I think that all of that kind of fits the narrative that the author of Luke does, in the whole course of the rest of the gospel, and also the book of Acts, this great capacity as a storyteller, including some of the Lucan things, including like Luke's decision, the author of Luke's component of wanting to have like women and men both prophesy, and that happens when, in the first two chapters, when Jesus is brought to the temple, and we have both the prophetess and the prophet both in the temple, the old people announcing that Jesus is the Christ. That would be quite an amazing thing for an ancient forger to add on, because to be able to copy the text so well, to have some of those inclusions. So for me, I would say I would definitely side with the majority of scholars and say no, that those are actually part of the stylistic whole of Luke Acts.
And I'm going to think now, Ghost Machine in Australia, I guess. Thank you for supporting the channel.
Thank you so much.
We have another question that just came in the live chat from Renato Gillian, who says, I know the cult of Mithras was a cult that competed in popularity with Christianity. Are there other obscure ones? And I mean, I guess I'm not sure what Renato means about obscure, but these were, I mean, there's a lot of
There would have been
or religion.
plenty of obscure ones, right? So I mean, obscure ones are obscure, so I won't necessarily know them off the top of my head. But yeah, so Mithras, this was a popular, semi-orientalizing religion but it was actually a Roman religion. Even though Mithras is a Babylonian deity, the cult of Mithras, or Western, the kind of Roman worship of Mithras, is the Romans have appropriated that original thing and have changed it all in order to make something that is more of, what we call like an orientalizing thing. It's, people like it because it has all the mysteries of the East, but it isn't as potentially as authentic in the East and authentically rooted in Eastern religion. It's more like a Western religion that is pulling that, which may be like something like how like a modern Western version of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism or something like that, where it's really rooted in Western, let's say maybe New Age stuff, and less so about the actual South Asian source or something like that. And so there's a bunch of so that's what Mithras, but there's a bunch of other mystery religions at the time that were very popular in the Roman Empire. So Isis, the religion of Isis and Serapis. So Serapis is the Hellenistic synthetic god that is brought together, and Isis also is incredibly popular. Cybele and Attis, so the many-breasted Cybele, there's the Eleusinian mysteries in Athens that became really popular in the Roman period. So they have an actual legitimate archaic precedent, but they become really popular. There's kind of a new one at the end at the time that actually Constantine, who ultimately becomes really interested in Christianity, is also kind of a proponent of, which is the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And that one's interesting to people because the birthday of Sol Invictus is also December 25th, and so in other words, so people like to make kind of ties with that. So there's a bunch of other ones. So yes, I would say.
All right. Well, the generosity keeps coming from the Southern Hemisphere. We're really good people in the Southern Hemisphere. We have Bryce Pardo in New Zealand. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. And Bryce asks, this is the question for you, John. Would you ever do a lecture on the life of Muhammad?
Um,
Do we
yeah,
do?
I would.
Okay.
We haven't done that. So
Mhm.
Landra's remembering is 7 years ago, I did a lecture on religious founders.
Yes.
And so I did a lecture where I talked about what we can know about Zarathustra, what we could know about the historical Buddha, what we could know about Jesus
Okay.
and Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad and Joseph Smith. So I did like all of those, kind of together as a kind of comparative study. Um, the the reason why I haven't as much gone into Muhammad and early Islam is it's a very specialized uh, study that I'm a little less familiar with. It's still within my zone. It's not all the way off in the Far East Asia, which I'm just less familiar with. But I feel like there's also a lot of really current, new, and revolutionary stuff. And so I feel like all of the reading that I did in graduate school back in the 1990s about Muhammad, and when I took one semester of Arabic, which is not like a lot, I feel like I'm a little out of date and I need to read some, more books on it to be able to speak with, some kind of authority, like I'd say. But it's something that's very interesting, and so yeah, I would definitely consider it.
I also want to thank Fire Ever Living in Wisconsin for your contribution. Thank you. Let's go back to the questions, John, that we received as comments that people left on our videos. There's one from Ghost Machine who says, if the letters of Paul were written before the other New Testament writings, did Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John use Pauline writings in their compositions?
Yeah. So, so I would say that so when we are doing things like when we're looking at literary dependence, so then when we're saying things like the epistle of Second Peter is absolutely literarily dependent on the epistle of Jude, so we know that the person had that in front of them and then they are rewriting it. Or when we're saying that the author of Luke and the author of Matthew are using Mark because they are literarily dependent on them. I don't think we can conclusively see any literary dependence like that. In other words, where we can say, here they're copying out whole chunks of Paul and putting it into their Gospels. But nevertheless, um, even if they're not using it or they don't have it because potentially the corpus of the Pauline epistles are not gathered together and circulating as an actual shared religious text yet. But they are written, and Paul has had an effect on the communities that these gospels are aware of. So even if they're not like using the letters to create their accounts, and we talked about this last week when we looked at the Acts, and we said if the author of Luke and Acts had access to Paul's epistles, when they're creating big long speeches for Paul, they would have just pulled it out of Romans or something like that. They would have just used text from Paul in order to create speeches instead of creating speeches that were clearly not written by Paul, which is what actually happens in Acts. And so what we can say though is that let's say the community that creates Mark, um, there's a verse in Mark where it says Jesus declares all foods are clean. Well, that certainly reflects the understanding of a Christian community after Paul's influence on that community. even if it doesn't actually reflect the historical Jesus. So we know kind of from Paul's own letters that everybody before Paul, actually the movement, it wasn't even called Christian yet, the proto-Christian movement would not have, they would have not considered all foods clean. They would have been keeping kosher in whatever limited way mid first century Christians were doing that. In Mark, though, that community that Mark is being written to, they already have a Pauline understanding that they don't have to do that anymore. In other words, that the Mosaic law has been fulfilled in Jesus, and they are not obeying those kind of commandments. And so that author then has put a Pauline precept or teaching into the mouth of Jesus, as an anachronism. And so we can say then, therefore, that all of the Gospels in a lot of ways maybe are aware of Paul. So that's even more so true for Luke. And it's even true for maybe a gospel like Matthew, which may have actually been written to be a counter to Paul's narrative. In other words, where the community that produced Matthew does believe that Christians should continue to obey Mosaic law, and so that's why it is continuously kind of saying that not, I don't come to remove the law, but to fulfill it, that not one jot or tittle of the law should be removed, and so on. So in other words, they're aware of it, they're just not using it, they're not using the writings to create their text, probably.
Thank you.
Thank
Ghost Machine. Okay, so that was from Ghost Machine. But we have another question from Julie Bizevsky, who says, since it is not part of my tradition, could you briefly explain what the rapture is supposed to be?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Take us
Julie, yeah.
home.
So, so the rapture, yeah. So we had just a month and a half ago or something like that. There were lots and lots of online Christians that somebody in South Africa, a preacher in South Africa, had, I guess, done the calculus or received a revelation or something like that, that the rapture was going to come in the middle of September. And so I think I mentioned that during a lecture because it was supposed to happen that day while I was giving the lecture, and then it didn't happen. And so, what's the rapture? So the rapture is an idea that was popularized in the 19th century by an evangelical leader, John Nelson Darby. And so this is part of what we kind of call dispensationalism, or a kind of a premillennialism. This is an understanding of the end of the worlds, the end times, where people, Christians who are believers in a certain kind of literal apocalypse and end of the world, and so they have created kind of a timeline of how they think things are going to happen by reading different verses that they pluck out of the Bible literally, and then try to put them on a timeline of the future. And so the rapture specifically comes from an idea that Paul has, and that he's writing in the letter First Thessalonians. And so he says, and I have the text here, so I'll read it. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, after that, this is Paul talking now, he's talking to other Christians in the Thessalonia, we who are still alive and are left. So in other words, so Paul is talking here about a personal belief that this end of the world is going to happen, he thinks, in his own lifetime. But if not him, then other people that are alive right now in his time period are going to see this end of the world. So he's totally wrong about that. But this is what he's talking about. He said, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds, and will meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. And so this is the idea of a rapture. In other words, that when the end of the world is in part of the timeline, when the literal end of the world is happening, some of Christians are going to be caught up in the air. And what is Paul trying to say here? So Paul believes, like lots of literal apocalypticists, that the end of the world is going to happen in his own lifetime. And he has been preaching that to people. And he's been telling people that we're all going to live, initially, that we're all going to live to see it because it's going to happen really soon. But then now a decade or so has gone on, and he's continued to be a preacher on this way, and lots of people have died. And so now he's trying to explain to people, or he's trying to rationalize it to people, what about all of these people? They'll be resurrected. What about us who are still alive when this happens? And so he's trying to piece out this idea together in his head. But what we can say about it is Paul was wrong. He didn't get to live to see that. It didn't happen in that generation. And so in fact, lots of other Christians don't interpret this way, this literal reading of Paul's stuff. Most people. So Julie, you're from a Catholic background, as I recall, right? And so the Catholic Church, along with Orthodox, Anglicans, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, a bunch of Reformed Christians and so forth, are amillennialists, which means it's a view that the millennial rule is already happening. In other words, when Christ came the first time, that has already put us into this spiritual and indefinite period of time that is ongoing. And so many of these churches still believe there's going to be a literal end times, but it doesn't involve any kind of rapture or anything like that in the meantime. So, or you can be more like where Leandro and I, our tradition are, which is that there isn't going to be a literal end times, but we are already in this indefinite spiritual period where we are trying to bring about a perfected world, but we have to do that through living Christ's mission and making the world a better place, not because the world is going to get destroyed in some literal sense. So.
Okay, I'll make sure I speak closer to the microphone because my voice is coming a little bit coming through quietly. Actually, there's a question from Rain Weber, John, about this painting that is behind me. Can you remind us what that is?
Yeah. Is that in the live question?
Oregon. That's the that's a stone church in Independence, Missouri, right?
Yeah. So Leandro is there in Center Place. He's in the communications and organ alcove, and you can see above the organ is a reproduction of 3 stained glass windows in a church that's called the Stone Church in Independence, Missouri. This is one of the earliest and largest special churches made by Community of Christ. And so there are three sets of windows, and if we can't see them as well from here, but if you zoom in closely, there's stuff about Old Testament prophets. There's stuff from the Book of Mormon, and then there's stuff about essentially Community of Christ in the 20th century. And so these are special traditional images, artwork that was created for one of the, I guess probably the most impressive Community of Christ church other than the temple.
I want to thank Sally and Phil for supporting the channel with your super chats. And this is a question I meant to ask you, John, at the beginning of this Let There Be Answers, but it comes from Fire Ever Living. Was anything interesting presented at the conference you were at?
Oh yeah, it was really interesting actually.
Good.
So I'm a historian by academic training, and so I actually don't normally go to sociology conferences like this, and so sociology is a little bit, it's history is a social science, and so it's adjacent, but it's very interesting to hear how it works. So my training is in ancient and medieval history, and so the amount of sources that we have are incredibly limited. Anything you want to do, as you're doing the medieval history of, let's say, any given pope, you may have only a handful of sources, one major source that you have to read against in terms of whatever its individual biases are. That is not the case for modern times, for contemporary times. The amount of information that we have in the information age is absolutely explosive. And so hearing young sociologists talk about how they are looking at trends by being able to, let's say, take a community on Reddit and access all of the data that exists within that community on Reddit on a given question, and then have to go through code it in order to pull it out, and then use large language models like using AI in order to sort data and things like that in order to give results that are statistically different even than, like, say, surveys. You know how we're used to surveys because of polling and the problems of polling, but suddenly now when you have hundreds of thousands of comments that you can now sort, it's like way more than a poll in a way, because you're not just using 800 people or 2,000 people, whatever your sample size. And so it was very interesting to hear new ways that sociologists studying religion are dealing with this explosion of data in the 21st century. So yeah.
And since we're talking about uh, sociology, there's another question that just came in the chat. Another question from Renato, who asks, why do some mixed religious traditions stick around while others disappear? For example, why was the pre-Christian Yule tree incorporated into Christmas, but other traditions died out? And I think we talked a lot about this, John, when you discussed the traditions that early Christians incorporated, all these, let's say, Greco-Roman traditions or Germanic traditions that were incorporated into what is the practice of the within Christianity. And I don't know if you have in your research you found a little bit of like why some traditions may be easier to incorporate into the dominant religion than others. I can think of, for example, um, like in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, like Spanish deliberately trying to suppress all indigenous traditions, but at the same time, the indigenous people were reinterpreting Christianity based on like the native religions, and so that's why in South America you have Mary was seen as Pachamama, which was a native goddess of the Andean people.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think that there's no one answer to any of these things, right? And so even at the even at the heart of the tradition, as I'm just even as you're kind of mentioning it, like even let's say as Christianity is emerging out of being a Second Temple Jewish sect, what from Second Temple Judaism is actually being retained, right? And so, for example, John the Baptist repurposes an existing tradition of mikveh bathing for ritual cleanliness, and this ends up becoming baptism. And instead of having it be about ritual cleanliness and obeying the law, it instead he repurposes this tradition and makes it and kind of even, let's say, makes it more intangible or spiritualizes it, making it about cleanliness from what we might say sin, but let's say that which separates you from God and brings you back into connection that way. And then that ends up becoming even which what he's doing is not an initiation ritual into Christianity. He is doing his own special thing that is based on a transition of that. It ends up getting retained in Christianity as the initiation ritual into how are you part of the new community you're joining, which is not what he was doing. And so you can just see how older traditions evolve in obvious ways that way. And the same thing, as described in the Gospels anyway, the tradition of communion is Jesus repurposing the feast of the Last Supper, not the feast, the feast of the Passover into a new kind of tradition. So that's even from Second Temple Judaism into Christianity. But in terms of, like Leandro was saying, as he was like referencing Spanish Catholic missionaries who are working on assimilating a far more alien culture for them into their worldview. The kind of practical advice even within Christianity on that goes explicitly goes back a long way. So Pope Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the First, who is essentially like thought of as sort of like being one of the first great medieval thinkers, as he's writing to Augustine of Canterbury, he sends the first mission to try to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And he gives them just a bunch of practical advice. He's like, um, put put the church right where the old, when you go in and break a pagan temple down, build your church right there. And when the same old ladies come and do all the things that they were doing at the pagan temple, just welcome them and call them Christians. Now, this kind of thing. It doesn't quite say it that explicitly, but there, in other words, there's like we'll take what we can get kind of attitude once you get to the Middle Ages, And so I do think that there's a sense of which ones are going to stay. Well, the ones that are important to people, and then the ones that stay or become important to people. And a lot of things that we think are really old aren't always really old,
Hmm.
and so things can move pretty fast. A tradition can happen. You do it 2 or 3 years in a row, and that becomes a tradition. And you imagine it goes all the way back, but it might only go to 14 or 1500 or something. So.
All right. I'm trying to keep up because there's a lot of questions coming in the live chat. Like for example, Ghost Machine. Thank you for supporting the channel, and also has a question for you, John. I don't know if you want to address it now or we can address it later. It's a question about, have you ever lost your own faith? And
Yeah.
I
So
think, I think that, I'm gonna put some questions. I'm just gonna have some questions here, um, that we can consider together because might be related.
okay.
For example, the question that I'm just gonna put here together from Anders and the Lister and from Josh Bedford, but I'll let you get started.
Sure. So yeah, Ghost Machine. I grew up in a very conservative, very literalistic, what I would call a fundamentalistic religion, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, and that was something that I was just that was like a that was something that was like a background, right? So that was just the universe that I was from as a child. I was raised in that. It's the one and only true church. This is how you understand it all. And I would say that by the time I was a teenager, by the time I was 14, I was a doubting teenager. I didn't believe the faith claims of it. The church said that the Book of Mormon was this ancient text, that it's describing a literal history of the native peoples of the Americas, that ancient so if you've seen the Book of Mormon musical, ancient Jews came from the Americas and became the Indians and things like that. And this was a time before the internet, so this was the 1980s, and I didn't have any literature, but just having looked through Mormon scripture, I didn't wasn't convinced that this was ancient in that way. So deconstructed this tradition myself as a teenager and had decided, well, it might be something that I'll continue to participate in socially because it's my culture. It goes back 7 generations, my friends, my family, and so forth. But by the time I became 18 and I kind of looked at it closely, because the church as it operates is sexist. It's every single position in the church is a priesthood role. Only males are in priesthood. It's all so it's a male only leadership. I decided, well, I'm not actually feeling like I can be part of this. And so I wouldn't call that though losing faith, because this is something that was just my background, and then I deconstructed it. And so then my exploration of is there a deeper, more nuanced meaning to life than just like this religion that's based on simple black and white answers to stuff? That was like more of a discovery than a loss, what I would call it.
And I think the two questions that follow, one from Anders asking if you've done a lecture on the Book of Mormon, and what Center Place and I guess Community of Christ feel about the Book of Mormon might be related to that. You have done a lot of questions
I've
about
done a bunch of lectures on the Book of Mormon, and so actually, some of my lectures on the Book of Mormon are regularly referenced within the Mormon community, especially as people in the Mormon community are having faith crises. Essentially, one of the things I'm best known for is some of my Book of Mormon lectures, where the idea that many Mormon apologists have had is that it would have been impossible for Joseph Smith to write the Book of Mormon in the amount of time that the story is that he composed it, and he wouldn't have been able to write it by orally composing and things like that. And my lectures essentially show no, it would have been quite feasible. It doesn't require a miracle for that to have happened. And my lectures show that that the text is fully rooted in the 1820s, the same time period that it's written. It is entirely of its time frame. And I also show, for example, or talk about how the Book of Mormon is absolutely literarily dependent on the King James Version of the Bible, not just in terms of its quotations, but in terms of readapting stories. So it'll repurpose a story of Peter being imprisoned and miraculously breaking out of prison in the Book of Acts and make that into a story that Book of Mormon characters do the same thing. And so as a result of that, we can say absolutely conclusively that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century document. There's no other, there's not in question. And what does Community of Christ just thinking about the Book of Mormon? What does Center Place think about it? So as you probably know, if you've been watching these lectures, we are not focused on literalism or historicity. We've shown in the same exact way that I just said that about the Book of Mormon, we've shown that the Book of Daniel, for example, is also a pseudepigraphical text that is written centuries after when the character of Daniel would have lived, that we can say that conclusively. And so just because that text is not historically what it claims to be, that doesn't mean we can't use it to enter into dialogue so that we can look at what people within the tradition were thinking at the time, and how that informs our ongoing discussion of meaning in our lives. And so I don't think of the Book of Mormon that differently than I do Second Peter or Daniel, or frankly the Pentateuch itself, the books of Moses, which are also, of course, not written by Moses.
And yet another question that is somewhat related to what you're sharing, John, is from the one that comes from David Latorre, who wonders if Community of Christ also believes in this idea of pre-existence of the soul before earthly existence.
So that's David. Yeah, that's a major component of Joseph Smith, the founder of the movement's later ideas. By the time he got to Nauvoo, of understanding life, afterlife, and pre-existence, and so forth. My personal feeling about both pre-existence and afterlife is that any kind of life other than this life is experienced in such a completely universally different experience, and in such a way that has nothing to do with our existence. It's so alien to us that it's all speculative, and we don't really need to worry about it. And instead, we should work on using the life that we have, and what are we doing in this life, and what is the meaning that we have, and that kind of a thing. So I mean, I it's fun to speculate about that. It's not I don't think we teach anything about it, or not about it. Certainly theologically, obviously there's Christ is pre-existent, because Christ has according to the theology is infinite, the same as God. In other words, existing before time. But
Although it's a belief that it's also present in some Gnostic writings.
yes,
We
right.
will explore 2 weeks from now.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. definitely something with Gnosticism as well.
Okay, I would like to thank Davius Tube, Anders and the Lister. Anders and the Lister, I don't know how your name came through without the at. Great. And Bryce, once again, thank you for supporting the channel. Bryce also says, I remember in a lecture, John said pagans don't think idols are alive, which I appreciate as a pagan of the Maori tradition because so many people get this wrong. I don't know what lecture
Oh,
may have been, but
yeah. Oh, Bryce, I'm glad. No, that's a, so this is an iconoclastic polemic, right? So people who don't believe in using statues or using pictures or images in order to uh, connect with the divine, they will often justify, they will often say that people who do use them, they believe that the statue or the painting or something like that actually is the god, and that's certainly part of the polemic uh, that exists in the Old Testament. So as ancient Israelite religion in the Second Temple period is becoming iconoclastic, in other words, they don't want to use images, especially statues and so forth, um, in worship. They then also create this false argument that the people who are using statues actually think that the statue is the god. We don't. That's not the case. It's a false polemic, and it's meant to be derogatory. And so I'm glad to set the record straight, and I appreciate you sharing your tradition, and I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you. Um, Trudy Gunderson writes, who's a friend. Hi, Trudy. We're so happy to have you here. Trudy writes, as an Indigenous person growing up in Community of Christ in the former reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I struggled with the curse the Lamanites. In other words, the understanding within the Book of Mormon that indigenous people of the Americas, and then also by extension, as it was later understood, into the Pacific Islands, indigenous persons were Lamanites, which are in the Book of Mormon usually portrayed anyway as the villains. And Trudy says that hit me personally in a negative way, and I had to look at the themes rather than the histories, and it took a while for me to grow with this. And so, yeah, Trudy, I appreciate that, and thank you for sharing that experience. I think that there is something to be said for the intent of the book, which is the Book of Mormon grows out of a settler culture. It's written from the perspective of white settler colonist European Americans, which was really quite terrible in terms of the indigenous peoples of North America and elsewhere who were largely viewed in very negative ways. What ways that we're about to evolve into Darwinian, actually not real Darwin, but um, pop Darwin racism of the late 19th and 20th centuries, but hadn't quite got there yet. And so in that sense, within that terrible bad context, the idea of the Book of Mormon that indigenous peoples represent a chosen people, a lost tribe of Israel, and again, it's got a white savior element to it of restoring them and that kind of thing. And there is an intent that is potentially positive, but the ultimate reality of it is it's rooted in the settler colonial worldview, and so therefore it is, it's an imposition on the native peoples and saying your own histories aren't true, and so we're going to wipe out all of your traditions and say that these are your traditions and impose them on you. So therefore, it's a form of cultural genocide. And so I appreciate you sharing this struggle and that you have come to terms with it in your own ways and where you're at with it. And I would love to talk to you more about it as we are approaching the bicentennial of the Book of Mormon, so that we, on the one hand, are are coming to terms with it as a people, so that people who identify as settlers can be aware of that error and apologize in those ways, and then people for who do identify as indigenous, if they do though have now reclaimed or claimed Lamanite identity, that is perfectly within the capacity of an indigenous person to take tools of the colonizer and making it their own. And so we don't want to tell anyone not to do that. But, but as we kind of come to terms with that in the 21st century.
Okay, I want to switch to one of the questions that came in the Discord chat, which I remind everyone we have a Discord server, and if you would like to participate in the conversation on Discord, just do send us an email, and we'll send you the invitation link. And this one came from K Tempest Bradford. I think it's a fun one. She says, I've been down a rabbit hole of Holy Grail stuff. I keep wondering about it and other alleged relics around Jesus, such as pieces of the true cross, of the spear of Longinus. Would people around Jesus have even kept those things? Are relics a thing in Second Temple Judaism or any period? Would anyone have picked up the cup from the Last Supper and been like, this is going to be important later? Would anyone have been collecting blood as it came out of Jesus's body? So I think this is a really, really fun question, John. I don't know if we have talked about relics in any of our lectures, specifically about how the whole thing of veneration of relics just came about in Christianity.
No. Yeah. Well, I mean, like just the example that you're even giving there, would anybody have picked up the cup from the Last Supper? So we are going to have a lecture on this within the not too long. I want to do one on the idea of the Holy Grail, and the reality is that the idea of the Holy Grail being an important relic is really late, and so it really doesn't become an important thing for anybody until I think it's like the 12th or 13th century.
Body.
And so it is actually that's a very interesting case study that we can do. So I would say in that particular case, no, nobody took that cup and thought it was going to be important later. Nobody was collecting blood in that cup from the body. That's not even biblical. This is a later. It's an entirely later tradition.
But I had to look it up, and apparently the first documented relics that we have in the Christian tradition are the bones of Polycarp, and so it's something that started during the martyrdoms of Christians in the second and third centuries. It seems
Right.
like before that era, no one was thinking about bones or other parts of people's bodies as people's remains as important objects. It is, I think, that shows that it might have to do more with traditions that come from the Greco-Roman culture as opposed to Israelite culture, because it is well documented that for example, some Greek cities had claimed that they had the bones of their mythical founders, like heroes, like I think Herodotus says that Sparta claimed the bones of Orestes, for example,
Yeah.
which is a mythical figure. Uh, but in Second Temple Judaism, which is the period when we're talking about, when Jesus and the disciples are running around Judea, uh, this is a time of an iconic monotheism that would have been, I would guess, really suspicious of any any object of veneration, um, like like these that we're talking about,
Right.
like especially like that something that is a remain of someone's body. However, we have to remember that, there's one thing when we read the Bible, especially Deuteronomy, with all the prohibitions and condemnations of anything that is not uh, the established temple cult, and the only just the cult of Yahweh as the only God. But we're talking about a culture that is still very diverse, and it's a Israelite culture. We have to remember that it is the descendant of Canaanite culture, and in Canaan, we do have not only archaeological evidence, like vast archaeological records of um, domestic cult, of especially the cult and the veneration of the family ancestors. So we have figurines, we have even caves, or burials under houses, because the connection with your ancestors was really central to the spirituality of the people of Canaan, which Israel it descends from this culture. So interestingly, there's even archaeological remains that suggest that these practices extended all the way into the Hellenistic period. So we're talking about, um, you know, a time where this is like well within Second Temple period, when supposedly everyone is a strict monotheist, and yet we still see that people at home are still uh, the tradition of veneration of your ancestors is still happening, even that late. Now, that doesn't mean that maybe you have like the bone of your grandpa on a shrine, but um, I think there may be a little bit of a connection there, like with the domestic cult uh, in this period, and what Christians a few centuries later start doing with the remains of martyrs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you're saying, Landro, these are going to be very diverse movements, and just because there's even high level prohibitions on things, let's say that doesn't mean that there's not popular veneration going on in different ways, And so, there's like, we may think that, what a very high level monotheism that's, like you say, aniconic, and it's forbidding all of these things. That doesn't mean that they're not following it. There's also, you know, within the early, late Second Temple period, Jewish tradition, there are Jewish sorcerers, who are using all of these, they're using inscriptions and they're writing them on bowls and amulets and things like that.
Yeah.
So in other words, even if the main line of the tradition or the top leaders are wanting to condemn things, so definitely the traditions are interacting with each other, and there's lots of popular stuff that's happening. In terms of, we have it like biblically from the First Temple period. As we're getting to that iconoclastic revolution, there's talking. The reformers potentially destroy the staff of Moses, which had been a uh, because they're afraid that it's being used in kind of pagan kind of worship or whatever. And so here's a relic that was at least attributed even to Moses, and they decide to destroy it. I think that this is a thing that is rooted in the tradition, both in the Hebrew tradition, but like you say, it's also in the Greek tradition. We have it becomes important because the power of the saints in the early Christianity is so of the saints, the martyrs in the early Christianity is so important. But then by the time um, Constantine gets involved, and Constantine's mother, she goes around and starts goes to the Holy Land. She loves all the Bible stories, and she asks all the locals, where's this and that, and they're only too happy to dig something up for her and say, here it is, give us a lot of money, so there's not a lot of possibility that there's a lot of historicity to those things, but they go back to the fourth century anyway. So it's been with us a long time, like you say.
Yeah, and if anything, those prohibitions that we read about in Scripture are revealing of something that is happening, right? If the writers, if the authors of these books of the Bible are writing about don't do this, it's because people are doing it.
Mhm.
Um, and so that is something that we have to remember. We would Let's go back a little bit to the questions, John, that came in before we started the chat. As I take a moment to see what is going on in the live chat, I have to catch up, folks. We have a question from Michelle Luz from Brazil, who says, "How did Christianity evolve from an end of times bodily resurrection to an in time purgatory slash heaven religion?"
Well, Michelle, I think that I think that I might even take this as an analogy to like ask how did something like the idea of Trinity evolve? It's um, it's that there are multiple ideas embedded within early Christianity, which is very diverse. There's not just one understanding. People have different competing ideas, and there's a and the tradition is actually pull in terms of end times and afterlife. The tradition is pulling on multiple competing ideas. On the one hand, the idea again of a literal apocalypse where you will have either died or lived to see it, and your body will be resurrected bodily and be fully restored. And then there's also, which is a more Middle Eastern idea of end times, Zoroastrian influenced idea of end times. And then we also have the more Greek, the more Platonic idea of the idea that everybody has a spirit in them, and the spirit, will is immortal, and that maybe in this sort of that influence, we'll have a future world where you'll have some kind of a perfected body that you'll be joined that's maybe a little different. And so I think that both of when you're saying as opposed to evolve from one to the other, I think rather what's happening is that both ideas and other more complicated ideas exist. And then, as different Christians wrote down what their ideas were in the first century, and they're kind of contradictory to each other. And there's other traditions that are continued to be in people's heads that later, as Christians, try to make sense of it all and make a much more elaborated version, the same way that they come up with all of the details of what constitutes Trinitarianism. How many natures does Christ have? How many wills does Christ have? Is he fully human nature or fully divine, but just one nature, or he has two natures, one that's fully human, one that's fully divine? Okay, how many wills does he have, and that kind of thing. That's not in the scriptures, but they're just trying to work it out. So same things like when you're talking about like a purgatory heaven. Purgatory isn't mentioned in the scriptures, and we don't get that word until the Middle Ages to describe an iteration of understanding of it. The idea of it may be rooted in it, but it's just a later elaboration. And so what I would say is that you have like a diversity of ideas that are floating around, and you just have more and more sophisticated thought as people trying to make sense of it, and especially when they consider the text to be authoritative and literalistic. So.
All right, here I am.
I bet. Hi.
And well, I've been catching up with the chat, but
Okay.
I see that we have another. I mean, actually, K Tempest has been really, really good doing her homework with a lot of questions. There's another question, actually, two questions that are somewhat related from K Tempest.
Okay.
Would let you, John, address one, and then I'll see if I can address the other one. The first one is, how much of a menace is Simcha Jacobovici to biblical scholars? This is like this Canadian Israeli uh, journalist. I think is he in? I've seen a lot of videos, or I've seen him in a lot of videos.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that he's most famous for this documentary, The Lost Tomb of Jesus.
Mm,
And so this thing is, it's taking, there was a find in East Jerusalem. It's called, I think, like the Talpiot tomb. And so this find which goes back, let's say, to the first century, and it includes 10 ossuaries. And that is to say, they're like little coffins where you take the bones of a person and you put it there, as opposed to like a full um, thing for a whole body. So after the body's decayed or uh, it has been broken down, the bones are put into a little coffin, an ossuary. And so one of these ossuaries has an inscription that has been interpreted anyway, Yeshua ben Yehoseph, which is to say, Jesus, son of Joseph. And so Jacobovici says that his documentary really pushes the idea this is the tomb of Jesus. They found Jesus's tomb. And so, this is not that it's, we talked about before about how when there's something that's a really famous thing, people would really love for the thing to be the thing. And so that, on the one hand, causes people to make forgeries. That's not, in this case, what we have probably, but rather we have, very common Jewish names. So, Yeshua, Jesus, is being named for the biblical figure Joshua, who is a very prominent person and a very prominent Jewish name that you name people. And same thing, Jesus's father, Joseph. So Joseph in Egypt is another very important patriarch. So, being named, Joseph or Jesus or Moses or any of those names is not Judah. These are all very common names. And so it's not a huge big deal that you would find a name like that. But I think more to the point, Jesus is not from, a rich family that can afford a tomb. And even in the gospel apologetic polemics that's imply that state that Jesus has a tomb, it's not his tomb. It's made out to be this rich member of the council, as I ultimately understood, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, because Jesus wouldn't have had a tomb. In other words, this would have only been the ultra elite that has this. Jesus, Joseph here, Jesus son of Joseph. This Joseph is a carpenter, a woodsmith, a person who's effectively at the peasant class from this nowhere nothing village in Nazareth in Galilee. And Jesus is not somebody who becomes this elite high priest scribe guy or something like that. He's a guy whose entire movement is about giving away all your possessions to the poor, And so if they'd all pooled all their money together to have this big tomb and to inscribe something, that would be like kind of the biggest deal in the world. So the reality, unfortunately, of this is that this conclusion that is part of this documentary, all archaeologists, Christian theologians, linguists, biblical scholars, everybody agrees this has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. I absolutely agree with that as well. And so, when people are making popularized videos of things that are certainly not the case, you can decide, K Tempest, how much that is a menace or it's just what people do. People continuously make things that aliens made the pyramids and so forth, and that's what people do. So
Yeah, and I think that the issue there, and this is related to the next question from K Tempest. The issue is sometimes academia is less exciting than what I would describe as popular academics.
I,
Um,
I think it's very exciting.
well, but the
But
problem
the
with
thing we find exciting or maybe not sensational enough. I don't
when
know.
when you have to do like an actual academic paper or a dissertation or something, you're gonna suffer through just finding evidence and putting footnotes so that any claims that you make can be properly supported. Because otherwise, when you get your peer reviews, they're gonna say you you just cannot conclude this. But sometimes when scholars and sometimes like really um, good smart scholars do works that are not necessarily academic, they might take the liberty to come to conclusions that is not fully supported by the evidence. But then that work is not going to be peer reviewed because it's for the general for a general audience. So K Tempest was asking about Robert Eisenman's idea about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Essenes, uh, saying that his ideas are controversial when his books were published, but wasn't he right about them being a sect in Herodian times instead of Maccabean times, and being messianic, also likely being militant? And also, Robert Eisenman's has this theory about the Apostle Paul being a Herodian, like someone from King Herod's family. Now, I'm not super familiar with Eisenman's work, John. I don't know if you are.
I don't think so. No, no, I'm not sure.
So, what he claims that the Qumran community um, behind the Dead Sea Scrolls was like was linked to the early Christian Jewish movement, and so you know that you have heard of the idea of the teacher of righteousness that might actually be James the Just, and then the wicked priest might be talking about Paul, and so my understanding is that Eisenman is one of the proponents of this connection. Um, so part of the problem is that this is a really interesting idea, and wouldn't it be awesome if that were the case? But the reality is most scholars disagree with him because you just cannot just support that conclusion with the evidence that you have. I mean, it is really intriguing and is really interesting, but really it wouldn't pass. Like his ideas like that would not pass a peer review.
Yeah, when you have like a, like again, the teacher of righteousness, right? So you have like a unknown figure that's not named, and then you have like a set of famous people that exist in the time period or whatever. Then you want to line them up, and it makes it exciting if you can. But the reality is there's only a tiny percentage of stuff that survived, and so they're not all talking to each other. They're not all from the same thing. Overall the Qumran community doesn't look like, otherwise all of its writings and everything that it has doesn't look like the proto-Christian movement, that, let's say, the Jesus James movement in that sense, and so yeah, I would say that this is also a thing that can't be, it's a theory that you would love to do, like it's like these things where we say, well, the beloved disciple is so and so, and we can't make that. I mean, in that case, that's just a aligning with an unknown figure and then trying to pick somebody in the Christian movement that is named and trying to add on into it. Here's an existence of a different sect, I'd say. And so probably the most we can say is there some kind of a tenuous overlap. We don't know enough about where John the Baptist came from, and so maybe he had spent some time with the Essenes. We don't know, but it's not that they're not writing. I would say that they're not writing about James the Just when they're talking about the teacher of righteousness. They're considering their own understanding within their own sect.
Okay, we have a lot of questions that came in the chat. But first, I want to thank Jager Uba for your support, and also Mark Crego and Josh Bedford. We'll get to your question in a second, but first, thanks again, Mark Crego, for supporting the channel. And the support comes with a question. Mark says, my question: how can we recover the Jesus gospel of love amid Christian nationalism? In other words, how can we repair this broken world? I guess through recovering the Jesus gospel. And I think, Mark, I wonder if so. I don't know, John. The way I interpret this question is, um, assuming that there's a real message of Jesus, perhaps a historical Jesus, that has been somehow uh, altered throughout history by the fact that, well, Christianity has been in conversation with power, with empire, with institutions. And so maybe as a result, the original message of Jesus has been changed into something that is not really what Jesus was teaching. And so, if such a message existed, can that message be recovered, and can that message help us fix all the problems of the present world? That's my interpretation of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I interpret it that way as well. Um, yeah, so modern Christian nationalism in 21st century United States is has very little to do with Christianity, and it is based on the inherited uh, let's say understood kind of ethnicity and national identity of white identity people, let's say like myself. So in other words, people who have grown up in the United States that identify as white, although people are I'm actually a 14th generation settler American, whereas I think a lot of people who are part of this myth are much more recently on the boat and off the boat or whatever, and would not have been, my ancestors would not have considered them to be white when they when they got here in the in the 19th and 20th centuries and stuff. But anyway, uh, and so they have, and so this is based on it's an outgrowth of nationalism and so forth, and it has very little to do with Christianity. Christianity is a dressing on top of this kind of modern idea. And so how can we recover, Mark, the an actual messages of Jesus, who is in fact not white. He exists before the idea of white identity, essentially thousands of years before any such thing exists, and instead is a Middle Eastern person who is coming out of the Galilee, which is already a mixed place, but obviously he is of Judean descent within this multicultural society that he is part of, where he is at the center of a religion that is absolutely multicultural and whose goal is to convert all the world. The reason why Christians didn't even retain the gospel in Jesus' own language is because the language wasn't important. The reason why we have the Bible translated into more languages than any other is because the whole message of the gospel is the good news is for all kindreds, tongues, and peoples. And so what can we do to repair this broken world? So whether or not this is the best or most effective thing to do, myself, people that every once in a while ask, won't you go on somebody's channel and debate them and shout and scream and do the kind of fight or cage match or something? And I guess I feel like that actually gets into a cycle of negative back and forth. And so the goal what I try to do and what we try to do on the Center Place channel is to model a different way. People said when social media happens, nobody's going to listen to a 2-hour lecture anymore. You need to make this 5 minutes long and so forth. We just decided, well, we can't explain it in 5 minutes. We might have to give some context to this. The context might take an hour before we actually get to the topic. And so we just went ahead and did it. And we've been able to have a good response and have a community here that is interested in more truth, that is more nuanced, that is well grounded. And so my way to work on repairing the broken world is by trying to model a different kind of behavior, and not fight and condemn and name call and all of the things that is happening in the negative cycle, but instead by modeling and creating a space and creating community that is based on Christ's actual teachings, the actual, what we can say historically are there. That's how I do it. Whether or not that's effective, you'll have to judge whether we're accomplishing anything in the face of all of the problems. But that's what we're trying anyway.
Okay, there's a question from Josh Badford, who says, as a queer Christian, What do you think about anti-gay passages, particularly like something like in the writings of Paul from the first chapter of Romans? Romans 26:27 famously says, "For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error." So Josh is asking, so what do we do with these things? You know, there are things like prohibition of eating pork, uh, but there's also things like that that are even like this is Paul.
Sure. Yeah. So we don't have to worry about, as you're pointing out, Josh, we don't have to worry, of course, about prohibition of pork or the idea that in Leviticus, it says if a man lies with a man like a woman, it's an abomination or something like that. That has no incumbency on Christians because Christians do not obey Levitical law. So you can eat pork all you want, and you can have tattoos. That's another abomination or whatever in Leviticus. We don't keep the Sabbath holy because that's Saturday. In other words, all of these things are not part of it. But like you point out, we have, unfortunately, Paul decides to wax on for whatever the reason. We don't know. I've had a lecture where I followed the academic argument that the reason why Paul is actually interested in this is that he himself may have, even though not acted on it, but may have had inborn same-sex orientation, which is what causes his mind to dwell on this. And so we wonder, in the same kind of sense, what I'm going to suggest here, though, is even what Paul is doing. When we've gone through the Gospel of Thomas, and at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, we have this very strange saying at the end where Peter says in the Gospel of Thomas, get Mary out of here because women aren't worthy of life. And then Jesus responds, I will make Mary, a man, and so on. In other words, this kind of very strange proto-Gnostic saying about an inclusiveness that Jesus is making that sounds to our ears and 2,000 years later very, very sexist. So part of the problem is the ancient world is so alien from us that when like if they ever talk about some of these topics, it just terrible. So even so, the Gospel of Thomas is trying to be inclusive and of women, and yet ends up sounding kind of sexist to us. That's not what's going on here. But what I want to say is, like, when he's talking about, as Leandro was reading it, exchange natural intercourse for the unnatural. This has nothing to do with prophecy or God or any other thing. When he's talking about nature, he is referring to the Hellenistic world and how they understand how the natural world works. That is to say, science, ancient style, natural philosophy. And so people like Aristotle argued that certain things like this are done according to nature or against nature. And this is not accurate. So there's all kinds of understanding of nature and science in the ancient world that is absolutely 100% wrong. Aristotle largely thought that anything that you have naturally is largely has one specific purpose, and yet we know, for example, our tongues are used for talking and also for tasting and so forth. This idea that everything has only one kind of natural way is false in terms of same-sex activity. We know now that in the animal world, obviously, huge percentages of animals engage in same-sex activity. Some animals engage more in same-sex activity than in opposite-sex activity. It's because sexual relationships are not only serving one purpose. What we can say is that there is all sorts of, one of the wonderful economies of creation is that we have all kinds of you don't have to have just one thing for any one thing. There's all kinds of other things, and so there's all kinds of wonderful things can happen from the same basic parts, and so we're more than our whole. What I can say about it is that in terms of how we deal with it as Christians, um, Christianity is not about getting a list of commandments and following them literally to the letter. Christianity should not be about worshiping texts, making text an idol, and becoming Bible worshipers, putting a Bible between ourselves and connection to God. Rather, when we read about the teachings of Christ and the actions of Christ, Jesus is continuously telling us to act out of love, to act out of understanding, not to follow rules literalistically in such a way that we harm others, but rather to understand broader principles. And so Paul's discourses that he has, where he's giving his speculation based on contemporary Hellenistic science that is false, we can discount in the same way that we can discount that Old Testament prophets thought that the world was flat, or that Paul thinks that there's a certain number of heavens in the sky and that kind of thing. That's not the way it is, and so we just have to understand these guys are limited by their own time.
Yeah, and it's also he's mentioning all these different levels of heaven. That's part of the cultural context that we need to
Sure.
be aware of as we're trying to understand what they're really trying to say. Yeah, I guess Josh. Yes, I didn't mention the pigs in a blanket. So yeah, I'm doing. Now I'm not sure if dynamic equivalence of what you said, maybe more of a paraphrase, kind of translation here. Um, all right, thank you, M, for supporting the channel. Now a fun question for John from Jake D. If you were given unlimited access to the Vatican archives, what would you most like or look for?
Well, the reality, Jake, is that there's so much content that is available that I can't, like access. I mean, I don't have the time to access and look at all the stuff that is very freely available. And so, I don't know that there's, I certainly don't have a conspiracy that I think that anything that's hidden away, in terms of an ancient document that they're hiding and don't have. And if there is, I'm not worried about it. And so, I mean, there's all kinds of things. I've been to the Vatican Library, and there's all kinds of things that I think are miraculous. The last time, I was there, one of the artifacts that they have is a particular world map called the Borgia map, and I had written a graduate thesis on that, and so I was very excited to see that for real, see the actual artifact of it. It's a map that is engraved on metal. There's all kinds of things that are in the Vatican that are just wonderful to see. But in terms of doing research, so much stuff is available now that I can't access it all. In other words, I don't have time to read all the things that I already do have access for, and so I don't have things that I'm specifically looking for. That's not a fun answer to the question, because because I don't know if you have anything, Landon. So.
I'm trying to think, but I don't know. I would like to get just exclusive access to the Sistine Chapel, which is in the middle of the whole thing, without a million tourists just pushing you around. So
I was super excited that when we went to the papal the historic papal bedroom or whatever that had the painting of the School of Athens, that we have on the wall behind you.
Yeah.
It's not, you can't see it behind you, but anyway, it's up to your right. That was really cool to go see that. We saw the original of that.
That's when you realize that the School of Athens is actually St. Peter's.
That's right. And I'm a medieval cartographer, a map maker, so I loved just even the aisles and seeing the early modern the frescoes of all of the Hall of Atlas of maps, that we walked past. That was really cool. There's all kinds of just amazing, medieval manuscripts that are there. You can just looking at things like the Codex Sinaiticus, like the earliest full surviving Christian Bibles, from the fourth century. I mean, it's an amazing library. So, okay.
Okay, there's a question that came in. I had not seen it on Facebook. Thank you, David Carey, for and sorry I didn't see it before. David says the Greeks had a concept of invoking a demon into a statue to animate it, whether you believe that's literally or just empowering it. Did the Canaanite traditions have a similar concept or just typically a reminder, like how we have Jesus on the cross hanging on the wall? Um, I don't think we have like specific evidence from the very limited library that we have from especially Ugarit about what cultic practices that involve statues really were in Canaan, but we do know that within the larger context of Semitic culture, like Mesopotamian culture, and all the cultures that were uh, Egyptian cultures, like were really in Hittite culture that were in close contact with Canaanite culture. There was a rather similar understanding of like the statues being like the not exactly what I say it denounces, like as if people really believed that the statues were the god, but this in I think in the same way that you could say that Israelites understood that the temple itself was the house of the Lord. The other peoples believed that it wasn't the temple itself, but it was the statue where the presence of the god uh, was contained within the world. I guess I would say that yeah, with the Yahweh would not be able to be contained within a statue, but probably you would say that it was the temple was containing it. So in a way, it is the same thing. You have a physical thing in the world that is containing the presence of the God, whether it's a statue or I guess a statue would allow the devotee to have a little bit more of a personal connection as you feed you can bathe the god, you can feed the god, but that doesn't mean that you think that that statue is the same as the god. And that's something that you see if you go to a Hindu temple, for example, because those things continue to happen within the Hindu tradition.
Yeah. So I think you just gave the perfect analogy for that, Leandro, which is to say, um, when I'm saying that the pagan, whatever, the Canaanite, the people who worship the old gods or Hindus, they don't think that the statue is the god. That doesn't mean that the statue, like you're saying, doesn't have the genius of the god in it in some sacred way that it's horribly offensive if you do something terrible to this statue. But but the analogy, like you're saying, Landro, it was a horrific desecration of the second temple when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes comes and desecrates the temple. It doesn't mean that they think that the temple is the god, but it does very sacred to the god and holy to the god. And so that's kind of the idea. There's a bunch of people who, let's see, there's one of the many cats that is just coming. Anyway, it's the same as, like there's a lot of people who get really upset if, like if somebody takes a flag and burns a flag or something like that. It's not
Mhm.
like you destroyed the country or something, and yet it somehow affects people, because they understand the whole sense of it to be part of, to have been offended in some horrible way. So you have a special thing where you bury it and all kinds of old flags and stuff.
Another question comes from Ricky Palacios. I don't know if you would like to address it, John. Ricky asks, "What is the Olivet Discourse?"
Um, so, so there's this idea that as all of it, it's called that because it's something that Jesus is delivering on the Mount of Olives according to the Synoptic Gospels. So it's in originally Mark, and it's then also carries over into Matthew and Luke. And so I think that what's happening in there is, Jesus is asking, responding to the disciples' questions about the destruction of the temple, the end of the age, and so forth. And so, this is where the author of Mark is also an apocalypticist. So one of the reasons why apocalypticism and the idea of the literal end of the world has a real sway on Christianity is because in the first century, when a lot of these texts are written, that is what a lot of them all believe. And so one of the reasons why we date the Gospel of Mark to the year 70 is that the implication, the cat is here again. Okay, come on. The implication is that the temple has already been destroyed, and now, excuse me, and now the author of Mark believes that the end of the world is going to happen in just a couple of years, right? And so this is what is going on in this discourse. And so anyway, so it's as opposed to something that is dating to the actual historical Jesus, it's more likely kind of a thing that is animating the author who is writing at this crazy moment when a quarter of the Roman military has come to Judea in order to destroy, the whole world as the Israelites have understood it. Here the temple and everything has been wiped out. If anything is going to represent a literal end of the world, they felt like this would, and then they were proved wrong because the world didn't end in just a few years later. So.
Another question comes from Kinetic. Kinetic asks, what do you think of the idea that Flavius Josephus was actually none other than Joseph of Arimathea, which I think I heard that idea somewhere. I heard a lot of there's a lot of wild theories about Joseph of Arimathea, but um, it doesn't. I mean, it's again, it's like this kind of, oh, what if? Wouldn't that be cool? But it's really
Yeah.
not you can't support that with anything, with any. There's no archaeological, linguistic, textual, or even chronological. It doesn't even make sense chronologically.
Yeah, because Joseph of Arimathea would have been an older rich guy, if there was such a person historically.
There was such a person.
Joseph of Arimathea. He would have already been an older rich guy at the time that Jesus is dead in 32 or something like that, and Josephus is too much later than that. And even though chronologically it doesn't work, the other way we would say it doesn't work is we have lots of writings of Josephus, and so it doesn't work chronologically, but let's say if it did, if Josephus was writing in the 30s instead of writing 50 years later than that or whenever he writes. And so even if it worked, if he was a guy that was interested enough in Jesus to actually go to Pontius Pilate and ask for the body and then go and bury him in his own tomb, he would write more about that. In other words, he wrote a lot about a lot of stuff, and if he wrote about a lot about things that he did, and he wrote a lot about things that he pretended to do, I would say, as opposed to things that he actually did. And so so I think that that he wasn't shy about putting himself in the story, and so if he was part of the story,
Right.
he would have wrote about it. So I'd say the answer to that is not possible. So we can discount it.
There's another question from Doubting Flock. Why should we not worship the sun, as it's factually the bringer of all light and life to our existence, and which ancient sun cult would you recommend reviving for this purpose? Now,
Sure.
nobody says you should not worship the sun, but
Yeah. If you wanted to, yeah, like you say, it's the bringer of all light to our existence in the solar system here and on Earth. And lots of people have come to that conclusion, doubting. So, for example, we did a lecture on Akhenaten and tried to kind of overturn all of the most conservative religion in all of human history, Egyptian religion, and try to get everybody to get on board with that. And didn't quite work, but he tried. Same thing when we were just talking at the beginning of this about some of these other some of these other religions that were potentially popular at the time of Christianity. One of them was Sol Invictus, and so the worship of the indomitable sun is one of the kind of newer, more popular religious traditions in the Roman Empire, and so that's certainly something that people were interested in terms of and so why wouldn't you do it? Why wouldn't I do it? Well, I use the sun all the time as an analogy, but I would, as opposed to focusing on something that's so materialistic and about materialism, I use like the analogy. I like the analogy that Plato has, where the sun in our world, in our universe that we experience in the material world, is analogous to the idea of light and truth in a transcendent sense. So the analogy of the sun is one of the analogies that Plato makes in the Republic, for example. But you're perfectly free to, and so I think people like Akhenaten. That's more if you're going to revive it. I think people are more interested. But actually, there's all of the
There's a lot.
Aztec sun stuff too. That was
Yeah,
the Mayan.
recommend Inti from the Inca
Yeah, yeah,
people.
yeah.
Okay, let's see. Let's go back a little bit to our questions that came in before we started the chat.
Okay.
Um, we have a question from Jizzery. We hear a lot about the synoptic gospels, but where the hell did John's gospel come from? What's up with that?
Well, sure. I mean, we hear a lot about the synoptics, I guess, because there's more of them, and so we talk about them more, and also because scholars in general of the historical Jesus think that there's so much more connection between these and the historical Jesus. So with the synoptics, as we've noted, that Mark is the earliest narrative gospel, and they also include a series of sayings that have all of the sense of them as being from the oral tradition that most scholars think have roots in many cases to the historical Jesus. Whereas in the Gospel of John, which has its own independent tradition, very few, if any, of the sayings that are created in John are the kinds of sayings like a parable, or like doesn't have any parables in the Gospel of John, or like a pithy saying, that can pass through oral tradition. What we have in John's Gospel instead are dialogues that are the invention of the author. And so these are things that don't come through an oral tradition, and so we can't imagine, and so therefore they don't go back to a historical Jesus, because they're written 60 years after the account, and they're part of a literary narrative that the authors of the Gospel of John are having. Where does it come from? So it comes from a community of Christians that we can't really know about for sure, other than the in terms of for sureness anyway, other than the internal literary evidence in the gospel itself. And so based on that, we can tell that this is a mixed community, some of whom are Christians who are of Jewish origin. Some of them are Christians who have converted from worship of the old gods, from Greco-Roman paganism of some kind, or Canaanite paganism, Syrio-Canaanite paganism. And some of them are also Samaritans, because we can tell within this gospel that that there's a mixed community based on what the gospel itself says. We can tell that some of them are from have been Jewish Christians, and have now separated themselves from their former co-religionists, because in two places in the gospel they talk about getting kicked out of the synagogues for constantly preaching to the other Second Temple period Jews about Jesus being the Messiah, and those guys were tired of them saying that, and they kicked him out. And so we can kind of tell those things about it, and so it represents a separate tradition. But where exactly it comes from, so there's later Christian traditions that are associating it with John, and that associate that with Ephesus. There's other people who, though, suggest that this community could have been somewhere in Syria, like Antioch or something like that, or even that there's some of it may come from some of the sources may actually come from Alexandrian Christianity. So it isn't clear, where it's from, but it's representing its own unique tradition that's separate from the Synoptics.
There's a question that capacity for joy left on the question from many Christianities to one church. That's for you, John. Did your research include any details about succession rites or practices for the early bishops? That's a
Yeah.
question many
So we were talking
Christians.
about in that lecture how from when the traditions are written, the bishops are already in charge of churches, and so they looked back and wrote down the traditions of trying to explain how do you get from Jesus to them. And their argument ultimately is that Jesus appointed apostles who appointed bishops, and then bishops have been following after one another in succession all the way up till the present day. But how exactly do you pick who the next bishop is? And so when we look at the earliest evidence, it's piecemeal. Of course, we only have so much evidence of the earliest Christianities of how anybody's doing it. But the practice generally is that bishops are elected, and they are elected by the local Christians in the community along with the clergy, and that they then settle together on a candidate, and that candidate then seeks recognition from neighboring bishops. And in a lot of cases, we'll see that like a neighboring bishop might come and supervise the process of the election, or at the minimum, they might perform the consecration of the new bishop. And so this is how the church that doesn't have any hierarchy and structure in the early other than the individual autonomous churches in each city, it doesn't have an overall hierarchy. In other words, there's not pope and council and so forth, cardinals or anything like that has developed yet. But they're connected because the different different bishops in the surrounding communities are exercising a little bit of oversight of how these elections happen. But that system of having like a local election where the people and the clergy pick that's the way that popes, for example, in Rome the bishops of Rome are often selected all the way up. It's the only the reform that allows cardinals to pick that only happens in the Middle Ages. And so there is a system of apostolic succession in terms of the I'm sorry, episcopal succession, in that one bishop follows the next, but the bishops themselves aren't picking their successor or anything like that. It's an elective leadership.
Okay. Thank you. Mike was fishing questions in the chat that I totally missed.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So let's go back to our live questions. And thank you, Tom Servo, for your generous donation to help us continue to produce this content. And there's a question from Deborah Moore. Does Mark tell a story of a failed apocalyptic preacher, similar to a cult in its aftermath after a failed prophecy? So, what do you think about the Gospel of Mark? Is this like the product of a failed apocalyptic preacher?
Well, so I think that I think the author of Mark, in some sense, is a failed apocalyptic preacher, in the sense that so this is this apocalypticism that is, let's say, popularized in the book of Daniel, which is written in the second century BCE, and by a prophet, not Daniel, who was a person who would have lived hundreds of years earlier than that, a prophet who feels like the world is going to be destroyed in his own time period, and then that proves to be false. And so then people update the ideas of Daniel and the visions of Daniel that the world will end in a space of a little time and an hour and a day. In other words, they do the calculations over it again. And the author of Mark does that again, and believes that that the destruction of the Jerusalem temple is this great sign that means the end is going to happen in just a little bit of time, probably 2, 3, 5 years, something like that. which does not end up being the case. And so that's a failed apocalyptic preacher. And so one of the things he does is he puts into Jesus' mouth that, I verily I tell you, this generation will not pass away until you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. That vision from the Gospel of Daniel, which is now updated to now the year 70. And so, but of course, that generation does pass away. So not only the generation that was alive at the time of the historical Jesus, when the author of Mark is putting that prophecy into Jesus's lips, but the generation that is alive at the time the author of Mark is writing. And so those generations have passed away. And so, in the sense of if you want to read those things literally, I think the way the author meant them, then you can say it's failed in the sense that they predicted a literal apocalypse within the generation that they were alive, which did not happen.
There's a question from Mark 2322. It's an open-ended question, I would say. What is our view of the many world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism, indigenous religions, etc.? And how can we understand and respect humanity's expression to our local universe?
Yeah. So at Center Place, we are very ecumenically and interfaith minded. So we are not claiming ever that there is one and only true religion, or that the only way to find meaning in life is to be Christian. We explain rather that we have found in our own tradition something that's meaningful to us, and we're very happy to share that, and we're happy for folks to walk along in a path with us as we do. But if they also then find meaning in a different path and that speaks to them, then that is where they're called. I've created a while back, as part of our church, founded what's called an Encounter World Religion Center, where we teach about all of the world religions to people who come to Toronto and learn about them, and then go and meet people in their own places of worship, their temple, their mosque, their synagogue, and so forth, to native lodges. And we understand each other and break down barriers of misunderstanding, so that we can not operate out of bias and so forth. And so I think that the finding meaning in our own tradition, or finding meaning in truth wherever it's found, I think that that's certainly our outlook. And we've had people from all faith traditions really come and be at Center Place at different activities. And of course, we also have many people who are exploring, and they don't consider themselves theists, or they consider themselves atheists, and they also are finding meaning in dialogue in other ways, and that is also perfectly valid. And we're not condemning that either. So.
And there's another question. I'm not sure if this is also coming from Mark, who says, according to Orthodox theology, how should we interpret the actions of Judas? I love this question. Wasn't his betrayal necessary for universal salvation? I know the Gospels are literary and there's stuff like the Gospels of Judas, but what would a 1000 CE bishop say? And I like this question because this is something that even like as as a child reading the Passion, I always thought, well, it's almost like Judas was necessary for the whole thing to
Yeah.
happen,
Yeah.
right? Especially when we read the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John is blaming Satan for like Judas' decision, although it doesn't say that Judas doesn't have free will, but there's like this satanic influence at the very least. And yet at the same time, in the Gospel of John, Jesus, who is constantly identified with God, Jesus is constantly saying, I am in total control of the situation, having foreknowledge of everything.
Yeah.
Jesus allows this to happen. And so it almost reminds me a little bit of the book of Job, where pretty much between Yahweh and the Hasatan, the advocate, God is allowing this lower s Satan to just do all these horrible things to Job. It's not affecting his decision making, but it's God allowing bad things to happen. So what would I mean? I guess this question is about the like middle age kind of
Medieval bishop.
Christianity understanding, but even like it's also I wonder what we can say about it today.
Yeah. So I think we're going to get to a medieval bishop. They're going to like all of their thought is going to be based on Augustine, because that's just true for in the Latin West anyway. And so, in other words, he'd been the great thinker who is talking about these kinds of ideas. So we've done these explorations, like you're saying, Leandro, where we had a big, long, and complicated set of lectures where we were considering determinism, like free will versus determinism. And so one of the issues with Christianity, like a medieval, like Augustine, and a medieval bishop in the year 1000, absolutely asserts free will, right? So in other words, it's not about anyone's fated to do things, and that would include Pharaoh, even though it says in the Bible that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart that he would not let the people go. It's not Pharaoh still has free will, despite what the Bible says, and Satan entered Judas. Judas still has free will, no matter what the Bible says in terms of what you're asking, what someone in the year 1000 would say, or and that kind of a thing. In other words, there's free will is paramount. And so how do you handle that, even when the idea is that God had foreknowledge that it was going to happen? God has foreknowledge of everything because God is omniscient. And so how do you reconcile it? And so the complicated and maybe unsatisfying way that it gets reconciled is actually the way it has to be reconciled in most modern senses, is with this idea of free will versus determinism, of this middle path of compatibilism. In other words, where free will is compatible with the fact that things are determined. In other words, we are all choosing what we would choose. So Judas chooses this thing by free will, even though that's compatible with the fact that it was going to happen, or it's going to happen because it's going to be that he would choose it. And it's complicated about how compatibilism works. But in other words, the free will emphasis of it was what would have happened, if you're asking about the medieval bishop. So.
But yet they would have had an understanding of free will that is this more complex understanding that Augustine had, that has into consideration human psychology. From his perspective, he talks about grace as having to do with human capacity to make the right decision, as opposed to Pelagianism that he opposed, that says, well, if you know what's right, you should be able to do right. Whereas Augustine has a more nuanced understanding of psychology, saying that, well, even if you know, you might not be able to make the right decision. Is this perhaps linked to the idea of demonic, satanic influence, or at the very least, the condition of sin, of alienation from divine grace, that may lead someone to have their free will compromised?
Yeah, you could totally see that. So in other words, it's not, but it's not. It would not be interpreted that Satan takes possession of Judas and makes the decision for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the same kind of the thing that also strikes me of this, like what was being asked here. Marker is asking, as opposed to what we might say today. Another question like this is the fall, right? So Adam and Eve in the garden. So this is, in modern times, this is like reinterpreted, for example, in the Mormon Church, that actually God has given two competing commandments, and so you have to have done it, and so you're almost not blamed for disobeying one of them. and that's certainly the Mormon interpretation of that. But that's not an interpretation that exists in the original, in the original story, nor would have been existing in the Middle Ages. That's a modern reading of it.
Okay. Have a question from Rain Weber. It says, is Thomas, I guess the Gospel of Thomas, pseudo-Pauline? And no.
No, well, it's pseudo Thomas.
Right. Pseudo-Thomas, pseudo-Didymus.
Yeah. So the in the version as we have it, it has its first its first saying at the beginning of it, or its preface says, "These are the sayings of Jesus, which was given to, which he spoke to um, Didymus, Didymus Thomas, Didymus Judas Didymus. In other words, Thomas the twin." And so Thomas is, I'm sorry, Judas the twin. And so Thomas is Greek for twin, and I'm sorry, Didymus is Greek for twin, and Thomas is Aramaic for twin, and then the name is Judas. And so the idea is that Jude, not Judas Iscariot, but Jude the twin, which is Thomas. So it's not really written by Thomas, though. So anyway, so it's pseudo
claim that is written by Paul or anything. So
yeah.
No one has attributed it to Paul.
Right.
Well, I'm just noticing the time, and we still have a lot of questions. I don't know, John, if you would like to address one of the last questions that came in the chat, or one of the questions that we had a question someone asked specifically for this session, a question that came in from Pantai Ray, came before the live chat started.
Okay.
So where did the idea, Panta Ray asks, of being saved by faith? Okay, so where this idea of being saved by faith that is found in the Bible, both attributed to Jesus and explained by Paul. So where does this idea come from?
Yeah.
Panta says it seems strange that given that Judaism is, as far as I know, mainly concerned with actions and not correct beliefs. It's also very unique among the religions of the world today. Is there any precedent for it in the religious environment at the time? Or is it an entirely new innovation of the early Christians? The idea that you're saved by faith, by believing, which is like something that the Gospel of John really emphasizes.
Right. So I think that this is a kind of a unique thing that emerges out of Christianity, and it's specifically, I think we can trace it to Paul, and why this thing becomes important, and why Paul has it. And so there's a couple things that Paul's worried about that gets where he transposes religion to being about believing in stuff. And that, like, this is not, and nowadays, because we're all post-Pauline, post-Christians, and everybody cannot separate religion from being about beliefs. It's all about believing in something. And so we imagine that ancient religions were also all about having to believe in things. And it really wasn't about believing in things. For everybody, it was mostly, like you say, about acts that you had to do, correct actions. And it's not about beliefs. It's that we understand the world. It's not about believing in the ancient gods. It's that this is a way we describe how the world works, and as opposed to you have to believe in them for some reason. And so why does this happen as from Paul? I think that there are a couple things in terms of making it about belief. Paul is interested in having you believe that that Christ is the Messiah, and more specifically that Christ is Lord, which is a very specific formula coming out of Second Temple Judaism, where we understand God is so transcendent that we can hardly have a relationship with God except for when we experience God's glory, God's spirit, God in the physical universe. And when and what they called that was Lord, or God's glory, God's word in the world, God's logos. And so Paul is asking people to believe Not in that. Everybody already believes that God has glory and presence and everything in the universe. You don't have to believe in that. But what you have to believe is that Christ is that. And so there's where belief is thrown in as a thing that we now have to have. So he makes that important. And then in terms of the second part of it is being saved by grace, that this is an important formula for Paul because he is working out why, in a religion that he's grown up in, where so much he himself has called himself a Pharisee and so forth. In other words, where he is concerned with correct adherence to Mosaic law. He is trying to he is rationalizing for himself, or actually coming up with an understanding of why we don't have to live law. And so he himself is juxtaposing law with this understanding of grace. And so he's created those things together. And then, like you say, by the time the Gospels are written very much later, they have been influenced by that Pauline formula, so that we get both stories in Luke where Jesus will say, your faith has saved you, or we get things like John 3:16 or John 6:47, whoever truly I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. Um, and so believing and grace, these underlying formulas that are found in Paul, then become kind of the central expression of Christianity and the engine for it, to the point where um, all of us today can hardly imagine religion that isn't about just belief. So,
In the live chat, Tom Servo, uh, who asked, is following up the question about free will and Judas, and also thank you, Tom, once again for supporting the channel with your super chat. So Tom says regarding Judas, if he enabled universal salvation by his own free will, shouldn't he be a saint like Pontius Pilate in is considered a saint in some reckonings? And I guess I would say that I'm not. I wouldn't say that Judas enabled universal salvation through his free will. I mean, I guess you could interpret that it was God's plan that this betrayal would have to happen. I mean, that's a way of interpreting the story of the Passion. But I would say that Judas still, I think, in all the in all the gospel accounts, is acting out of greed, out of self interest when he does that. So that's why I would say there's nothing saintly about Judas' intention, whereas the idea with Pontius Pilate is like that comes from later traditions that are not from the New Testament.
I mean, there were some Christians who did rehabilitate Judas, right? So
Mhm.
there's a Gospel of Judas that takes it
The
from a different
Gospel of Judas, yes.
and so forth. So it would be possible to do that. What I would just say in terms of this is, this is sacred story, right? This is
Right.
the myth as we're telling a story. And so I think that so the where do you take it then? So should he be considered a saint? Probably not. He does become a thought experiment for um, for universalists, let's say. So if you are a universalist, which I tend to be, and you're saying that Christ's salvation is for everyone, so then that ultimately means that no matter what horrible thing Judas did or something like that, ultimately everyone is going to be saved. The problem with that is then you have a thought experiment on the other side. Well, you're saying, well, the Hitler's going to be saved and in heaven or something. And so, in other words, it's a complicated thing, and as you're going through it. But one of the things that like Augustine's formulation of being is that all being is good, and everything that since all being is from God and is participating in God, then everyone ultimately uh, who experiences being is ultimately rooted in good at some level or other. And so however we understand afterlife or any other thing of rehabilitation, um, there's prospects as opposed to um, it would be the universalist thought experiment. So in other words, we take these stories in order to do that same thing where we're able to have these arguments about what does free will mean, what is determined, do we
Mhm.
believe in determination, and it also can be used for us as we're thinking about things like universalism. So
But I think there's two things that you said it right, and we always have to remember we're talking about sacred story. We're not talking about like an account, like an accurate account of his historical event. This is a sacred story that is addressing two things. First, the question, well, if Jesus in fact is Lord, if Jesus is the Christ, then how come this happened? How come he was executed?
right,
Someone must have betrayed him, one of his closest allies, followers. And yet, well, didn't Jesus know that this person was going to betray? Yeah, of course, Jesus knew that this person was going to uh, betray him, and so that creates that the problem in this narrative. But the narrative also, as you also mentioned, it's just talking about something else. It's like we take for granted like our modern knowledge of psychology, but in ancient times that was one of the things that many of these thinkers, many of these sages, even Plato, we're trying to figure out. So why is it that humans do all the horrible things that humans do, and yet sometimes we can have noble intentions? So in Plato's uh, thinking, we have this tripartite mind where we have a noble horse and the crazy wild horse, and our, let's say, our
right,
prefrontal cortex understanding, the Platonic understanding of the prefrontal cortex is the charioteer that has to somewhat just balance the chariot between these two horses that are constantly pulling us in opposite directions. And I guess these stories are have to do with that. You cannot, in the same way that you're not going to take Plato's idea, we don't have two horses literally in our brain. Well, these sacred stories are talking about similar things, what happens inside our mind, and also explaining what happened to Jesus in this case.
yeah. And so then you can look at it, read it from the story also then load literarily. And so to the idea that like this was essential or necessary, it's not written that way where Jesus has to take him aside and say, hey, look, I need you to do this thing for me, because otherwise this whole thing isn't going to work out. That's an early reinterpretation of it that like is sort of as people are kind of getting there in the Gnostic tradition within the Gospel of Judas, for example. So
Okay, and it's been an hour, 2 hours, and almost 20 minutes of Let There Be Answers. And we haven't made it through all the questions that came in before the lectures, before this session. And we haven't also made it through all the questions that came in today in the chat. But
oh,
I think we're going to stop here. And I'm just taking notes of all these questions, adding them to our list for our next edition. And we can also, at some of you folks, we can continue to talk about that in our Discord conversation.
okay, that sounds great. And so we'll save all these. And thank you guys so much. This was a great conversation. We appreciate it. Great seeing you, Leandro. And I'm going to hang out with all these
Mhm.
cats here and
Yeah, go feed the
my brother
cats.
and everything else. Yeah, and all my family here. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.